Hello, my name is Fergus Neville and I'm a lecturer in Organisational Studies in the School of Management at the University of St Andrews. Now, my research examines group processes, including the roles of social identities, social norms, and group influence and leadership. With colleagues, I'm currently exploring how we can harness group processes to facilitate the public response to COVID-19. Now, the blurb from today's TEDx event states that connected aims to bring people together and foster a connection. And this is precisely what I'm going to argue for in my talk. Specifically, I'll outline the importance of shared social identification for solidarity, communication and adherence to public health guidance during the COVID-19 pandemic. In order to effectively tackle this pandemic, public health experts have advised mass behaviour change, and for us to do things like regular hand washing, wearing face coverings in public contexts, self-isolating if we have symptoms, receiving a vaccine if we're offered one, and physical distancing. Now, I hate the term social distancing, and I don't use that, because that's the last thing that we should be doing from one another. We need to be physically distant to prevent transmission, but we need to be socially connected and acting together as psychological group members. Now, many of these behaviours are very hard and have huge impacts on people's well-being and livelihoods. The question then is, in addition to providing practical measures such as financial support, how do you encourage people to adhere to such challenging public health guidance? Broadly, there are two strategies. One, you can try for compliance through the use of threats and enforcement, things like fines and imprisonment, or you can encourage people to act for the collective self-interest through an understanding of group processes, and that's what I'm going to argue for today. Now, it's important to note at this point that there are two types of group, physical and psychological. At a music festival, you might have a physical group of people who feel psychologically part of the same group. Okay, compare that to maybe on a crowded train where people are in a physical group but they're isolated and they're acting in terms of their individual identities. Now, you also get psychological groups which are not physical. So examples during the pandemic might be neighbourhood WhatsApp group, or something like that. So I've used the term social identity a couple of times there. What is that? Well, it's a radical idea from social psychology which helps us to understand group behaviour. Identity is not just a unitary or individual concept, but rather a complex system of multiple levels. Let me explain with a couple of examples. I have my personal identity. This is me, it's Fergus, looking smarter than usual in this picture. And at various times I might be thinking of myself as an individual and acting as such. But other times I'll have a social identity. So when I'm with my kids, I'll be thinking of myself as a dad or as a member of my family unit. Other points I might be thinking of myself as Scottish, right? So maybe when I'm watching Scotland to England at rugby. Or I might be thinking of myself as British if I was watching Team GB at the Olympics. Or other times I might be thinking of myself more in terms of a human being, so a much more collective level of identification. Now, these are examples of long-standing social identities, but social groups and identities can also be emergent, particularly when people feel they are faced with a common threat or fate, such as in the pandemic. Now, we've seen both existing and emergent groups during the pandemic. Now, the first consequence of shared social identification is a change in the meaning of self-interest. Whenever you hear the term self-interest, you should always ask which level of self. For groups at low risk of COVID, such as students, acting in terms of your personal self-interest might make mixing with friends attractive, as the benefits of not being isolated might outweigh the risks of serious infection. But when groups with low vulnerability think of themselves instead as members of a wider community, which is at greater risk from COVID, then priorities, social norms and behaviours change. One of the most remarkable things during the pandemic has been the formation of thousands of mutual aid groups throughout the UK and the rest of the world, including St Andrews. We've also seen your neighbourhood WhatsApp messages, volunteers at vaccination centres and participation in vaccine trials more recently. Wearing a mask is also a form of social solidarity because it offers relatively little personal protection, but it does decrease the risk of infecting others. So as people come to define themselves as a member of a group which is vulnerable to COVID-19, then behaviours change to protect the social group and to help fellow in-group members. And moreover, research shows that we are more likely to be influenced by others who we see as sharing our social identity. In other words, we're more influenced by those who we see as being on our side and acting in our group's interests. This is why trying to exert power over groups, through commands, threats and punishments, rather than through groups, explaining why behaviour changes in our shared interest, is a mistake. Now, there are 4 elements to this. First, it creates an us and them dynamic, where those in power tell the people to obey orders. Now, if people only obey an instruction because they're being threatened, then they're unlikely to continue complying when they think that they can escape detection. Second, there's evidence that many examples of non-compliance are related to structural inequalities rather than lack of motivation. So things like needing to leave home and earn money due to financial and employment instability. Blaming particular demographics therefore risks alienating vulnerable groups, lessening existing influence and undermining social cohesion. Third, it's critical that the public do not see one rule for us and one rule for them. That's why high-profile cases of those in power flouting the very COVID guidance which they espouse is so damaging to the public's trust and subsequent adherence. Fourth, threats also give a counterproductive normative message, and more on that in a moment. But essentially, it's logical to wrongly conclude that if fines are needed, then lots of other people must be acting in this antisocial way, and so perhaps it's more acceptable for me to do so. Instead, if communications and actions from those in power clearly define the shared identity, explain how we really are all in this together against a common threat, and that adhering to highly challenging guidance benefits our collective groups and valued institutions, for example our nations, our local communities, the National Health Service, then this increases trust in the guidance and public adherence. Now, I noted the importance of social norms when it came to threats of enforcement. Social norms are beliefs about how group members should behave and do behave. The government or press often bring attention to a small minority behaving in a problematic way in order to condemn the behaviour. This makes for dramatic headlines and perhaps tries to make an example of deviant behaviour, but this can be counterproductive because it gives false information about what the majority of others in your group are thinking and doing. Despite the fact that the vast majority of the UK public are adhering to the public health guidance, this can lead to something called pluralistic ignorance, where everyone in a group is mistaken about what the rest of the group are thinking or doing. And instead of highlighting these negative examples, we should be highlighting dramatically telling the stories of mundane adherence to really celebrate this idea of the remarkable achievement of the public so far in terms of sticking to this challenging health guidance. So in conclusion, while group behaviour is sometimes blamed for the pandemic, it is physical groups which are the problem, not psychological groups. Indeed, I've argued that psychological group memberships are critical to tackling the pandemic, not through tricking, manipulating or nudging people, but through framing messages in terms of the identities, values and priorities which people already hold. So I explained that we have social identities in addition to our personal identities, and that it's shared identity which makes group behaviour possible, which leads to 3 recommendations for the pandemic. First, we should emphasise shared identity in order to encourage acts of solidarity and helping. Second, those in authority should seek power through groups rather than over them, as that's far more influential and beneficial in the long term. And finally, we should be highlighting the positive behaviour of the majority rather than overemphasising the problematic behaviour of the minority.